Now, the Sony Xperia Z2 probably has one of the best cameras available on any smartphone right now. With 20.7 megapixel sensor, full 4K capabilities at 30 frames per second, I really want to see how it stacks up against a mid to a higher end level professional camera, such as any DSLR or camcorder. So what we're going to do is put up the Sony Xperia Z2 against my old trusty Canon 60D and see how they compare against in terms of image quality. So just before we begin this video, I want to mention to everyone that this video is uploaded and presented in 4K. So make sure you're at that 4K setting. Now, if you don't have a 4K monitor, you're not going to see the real major differences, but at least be on that setting so you can get the highest bandwidth and the best quality possible to see any major differences between the two. Now, looking at the Canon 60D, it's a bit of an older DSLR. It came out quite a number of years ago, but a lot of people are still using this, and the video quality is pretty much the same across many Canon DSLRs as well as some Nikon DSLRs as well. So it's a good kind of baseline comparison of what a good 1080p image should look like with some really incredible stills capabilities. Now, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the specifications of each of the cameras. Now, they're quite different in terms of the overall sensors inside. You'll notice over here that the Canon uses a much larger APS-C sensor, which is an 18 megapixel sensor, which is actually a lower resolution than the 20.7 megapixel sensor that's in the Sony. Now, interestingly, even though the Sony Xperia Z2 has a 30% larger sensor than most of your conventional camera phone sensors that are out there, at a 0.5 inch size, it's still very, very small compared to what you would find in any typical DSLR. The Sony Xperia Z2 has a pretty interesting lens on the camera. It's using Sony's own G lens technology, and it's a pretty wide angle lens at 27 millimeters with a maximum aperture of f2. Now, obviously, the great thing about any DSLR is the fact that you can change the lens. The one that we're using is a Sigma 18-35 f1.8 constant aperture zoom lens, which should give us some amazing video and stills capabilities on our 60D. Now, as briefly mentioned before, the Sony Xperia Z2 can shoot up to 20.7 megapixels stills, and each of those files is about 10 megabytes. And in terms of video resolution, we're looking at 3840 by 2160 at 30 frames per second, and it has a data rate at about 55 megabits per second. Now, our Canon 60D is a little bit lower in terms of overall stills resolution at 18 megapixels, but since it has the capability to shoot 14-bit RAW files, you're looking at a massive difference in terms of the data rate at 27 megabytes per photo. In terms of video, on the other hand, we're looking at full 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames per second, and it records that at around 48 megabits per second. Now, the first test that we're going to take a look at is one that most camera phones or any small sensors really struggle with, and that's low light. Now, the Sony Xperia Z2 has some fancy noise reduction technology that'll help eliminate some of those factors, but you're still not going to get away from completely clean, noiseless images. So as you can see over here, we have a scene shot with the Xperia Z2, and it's not bad overall in terms of its overall ISO performance from 200 to 400, 800, and 1000 ISO. It's certainly not bad, and it's very consistent overall throughout that ISO range. I don't find a big difference between each of these increments. Obviously, we can see that the 1000 has noticeably more noise than ISO 200, but it's not that much of a difference. Now, looking at the exact same scene shot on the 60D, we can say a pretty night and day difference between the cell phone camera and the DSLR. Even though the Canon has the lower resolution, thanks to its much larger sensor, we're letting in a lot more light, a lot more photons into the sensor, and the lens is probably helping out a little bit as well. Now, it's important to note that we didn't actually reduce any noise in software or in camera on the Canon 60D. What you're looking at is the pure, unadulterated, unfiltered shot straight out of the camera. And you can see that the ISO performance is really, really good. I mean, this thing can go all the way up to 12 12,800 if you want, and up to ISO 3200 is pretty darn clean. So this again proves to us that we don't really need to throw out our DSLR, because in terms of low light performance, it's certainly still king and certainly a lot better than even the best camera phone. Now next we're going to take a look at just the general stills capability of both of these two cameras and how they fare against similar scenes. Now you'll notice that the Xperia Z2 offers some really decent colors and overall saturation level is not bad, but when you start looking at the image quality of the Canon 60D, it's pretty much clear that the 60D is still amazing in terms of photo capabilities and the overall color depth, and the overall just pleasantries of the image is certainly coming through. And even though you could probably easily edit the Xperia Z2's images to make them more pleasant and to whatever your needs are, you still can argue with the fact that you just get a more dramatic looking shot with a larger sensor and a nice lens right in front of that large sensor. There's still something magical about a DSLR. And the cool thing about most of these modern day smartphone cameras is they have selective focusing mode, which is kind of faking that sense of depth of field where you can actually select an image and it'll defocus the background, so you're isolating your subject from the foreground more. And as you can see over here from my Blade Runner spinner model, it does a pretty decent job, but nothing to the level of true lens blur, and having a large and fast lens gives you that amazingly cinematic and dynamic and dramatic looking images that's still hard to achieve on a camera with a smaller sensor. That being said, of course, one of the things that the Xperia Z2 shines is detail and resolution. Thanks to its 20.7 megapixel sensor, you're able to resolve so much detail. In fact, in some cases, it's sharper than the Canon 60D. Even with its larger file sizes, it's still 18 megapixels. So you can technically see more detail in places where it's nicely lit and you have a lot of light. You could see a tiny bit more detail on the Xperia Z2, which is saying a lot, because the Canon 60D is certainly not the highest in terms of megapixels, but most of the Canon cameras are around 20 to 25 megapixels, so there's not much of a difference in terms of that, and it's pretty amazing that a camera phone is matching that image quality difference when it comes to the overall sharpness and resolution. Now here's where things get a little bit interesting in terms of the video functionality. Obviously, the Sony Xperia Z2 is technically recording 4 times the resolution as what you find on the Canon. The bitrate is not 4 times though, it's just a couple of megabits per second more than what you would find on the Canon, but in terms of the detail that it resolves in video is pretty darn astonishing. Even if you have a 1080p monitor and display, you could still see more detail than you would find on the Canon. The Canon is just simply pretty dull in terms of the overall sharpness. What you do see on the Canon is a little bit better color saturation and accuracy, but the Sony Xperia Z2 is definitely not bad at all. It has a decent amount of dynamic range, very little moire and image artifacting issues. So the big takeaway here is that the Sony Xperia Z2, in terms of sheer sharpness and resolution, is superior than the Canon 60D. In fact, it's probably superior than to most Canon DSLRs and most other cameras that are rated for 1080p, which is pretty darn remarkable, because you can buy a camera that's around $15,000 that does not match the resolution of this Sony Xperia Z2. Now, obviously, with any other camera, you're going to get a lot more flexibility. You're going to have a lot more options and control over your video. In terms of shallow depth of field, is very difficult to do that on a Sony Xperia Z2, and the overall flexibility of what you get on a real camera is obviously in a different league than any smartphone really out there. But it's pretty darn impressive to see such great image quality and overall resolution from a simple camera phone. Now lastly, another cool advantage of the Sony Xperia Z2, like most modern day smartphones out there, it can also do slow motion at 120 frames per second at 720p, which is actually twice as better as what the Canon can do at around 60 frames per second at 720p. So again, the Sony Xperia Z2, like most of the smartphones, have these DSLRs beat in terms of the slow motion capabilities. And that's really it, guys. If you have any questions about anything I talked about in this video, please make sure to leave that on a comment down below. My personal thoughts overall is that the Sony Xperia Z2 in terms of detail definitely outshines most of these Canon DSLRs that are not 4K compatible. In terms of color depth and everything, that's a different story. The advantages of having a larger sensor is still a big advantage in any DSLR body, and it will give you more cinematic, more dramatic looking shots that is truly going to isolate your subject from the background. And the lens option, there's too many capabilities of a DSLR still available that gives you a good enough advantage to still go with a good level DSLR than using a camera phone. Although the camera phone can definitely do some incredible stuff, and the lines between a higher level professional camera and a simple camera phone is getting really blurred, which is really interesting to see. So definitely love to hear your thoughts on this whole video. Make sure to leave that on a comment down below. If you like this video, please make sure to give us a thumbs up, as well as check out the description for more information about both products. But other than that, my name is Waj, and I'll see you later. Take care.